Dear learners, in this lecture we are going to talk about the petroleum provinces, how petroleum is distributed geographically, where do we find the biggest fields and how it is available in India. So, here we are going to learn about the petroleum province of the world. We are going to talk about the definition of petroleum reserves. We are also going to talk about the distribution of petroleum in the world as well as in India. So, let us learn few terms that we commonly use in the oil industry. We call a body of reservoir oil and gas that is subsurface as the oil pool. Now, an important thing about a pool is that there should be hydrodynamically connected. As we know, within a column, if you go down depth, your pressure will increase. So, if you take pressure in a pool and plot it in a graph, you will see that they are lying in the same trend. That is where we call it is hydrodynamically connected or pressure connected, and we can call this a pool. Now, if you have a accumulation of a single large pool or multiple small pools in an area, we call that as a field. Field, remember, is actually the surface part. So, if you have a large accumulation subsurface or a number of pools in the subsurface, the land portion at the surface is called the oil field. Now, if you have multiple fields located or concentrated in a geographical area, we call that as petroleum province, and I am going to show you example of all these in a little while. Now, pool, field, these terms are very loosely used terms, but the oil industry needed something where the terms can be standardized. Why it is required? Because if I say, if I follow a measurement system which is different than another country or another company, then there is nowhere we can compare how much one country has compared to the other. So, there was a requirement to use standard terms, so that when we compare, we know how much petroleum resources each country or each company has within its portfolio. That is why the large associations of the world like SPE, AAPG and WPC, they came up with a guideline. They basically divided the resource measurement conditions in two terms. In that table what you see, there is a range of uncertainty that is plotted in the horizontal axis, and then chance of commerciality on the vertical axis. So, when somebody called that I have X million oil reserves, it needs to satisfy 4 criteria. Number 1 is that the oil resources has to be discovered. So, it cannot be notional. You have to have absolute evidence that oil and gas is existing in a certain place. Number 2, it is not only that you have oil and gas, that oil and gas has to be recoverable using our existing technology. So, you have to have a oil resource which is discovered and then it has to be recoverable. Number 3 term that needs to be followed here is the commerciality of that oil pool. So, it is not enough to have a oil pool that is discovered and recoverable, but it needs to make a commercial sense. That means, your profit by taking out that oil from the subsurface by selling it should be more than what your cost is. That is where we say it is commercially viable. Also, the term reserve is not a one time term. Each company or each country measures their reserves on a yearly basis or on a 5-yearly basis. At whatever point we measure reserves, we need to have something remaining in that reserves, then only we can call it a reserves. So, when we say India has so much reserves, it has to satisfy 4 things, that is, it has to be discovered, the resource has to be recoverable and commercially viable, and there has to be some remaining reserves at the point you publish a reserve of a country. Now, let us understand the distribution of petroleum. Now, location of oil field is driven by not where the field is located today, but where it was in terms of millions of years ago, that is the paleo environment. Now, in the present day, petroleum can be found either onshore, over the land, or within the ocean, which we called offshore. Now, offshore fields can be classified in terms of the water depth. If the field is located at a depth where the water depth is less than 100 meter, we call it is a shallow water oil field. If the water depth ranges between 100 meter and 3000 meter, we call it a deep water oil field. And if the depth of water increases more than 3000 meter, we call it a ultra deep water oil field. Now, if you look at the overall distribution of hydrocarbon in the world, 70% of the oil and gas that we find are actually located onshore. Only 30% is located offshore. You can see there are some examples of the biggest onshore and offshore fields in the world as well as in India. Let us understand the geographical distribution of petroleum now. This map is very interesting. You can see these are few countries which is shown there, but the size of those countries are not based on their geographical size or geographical area, but the size is denoted by the oil reserves they have. You have learned about oil reserves, when we can call a oil resource a reserve. Based on that, at the end of 2019, the world has 1.73 trillion barrels of oil. Out of all these, 70% of the reserves are actually held by few countries, as you can see from the map. Now, these countries together have formed an association which is known as OPEC, oil producing and exporting countries. So, these countries have such large reserves which is much more than their domestic demand. So, they can export oil to other countries where there is not much of petroleum resources available. So, these countries together have formed a OPEC association by which they control the supply of the oil to other countries, and in the process they also control the price of the oil in the market. Now, as you can see, most of the countries that have the large reserves are located in the Middle Eastern region. Countries like Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia has biggest reserves of the world. The other big reserves that we have is a country in Venezuela, where the reserve is in the range of 300 billion barrels. So, the Middle Eastern countries hold about 48% of the reserves. Here I have shown you the members of the OPEC countries by underlining them with red. As you can see, there are about 14 countries today who are member of the OPEC association. Now, if you plot all these in a world map, you would notice that there are two outstanding regions which has been termed as the oil axis or the oil poles of the world. The first one is, as I mentioned, the Middle Eastern and the Balkan region, that is the region around the Caspian Sea and the Russian part, where you have large amount of oil. The other pole exists in the Gulf of Mexico, Venezuela region in part of North and South America, which has another 50% of the oil. So, these two are called as the oil poles of the world. Let us come to India now. Where do we find oil in India? Now, Geological Survey of India has worked in detail, and they have found that there are 26 sedimentary basins that are there in India. Out of that 26 sedimentary basin, we find oil and gas only in 7 basins, which are marked in orange color in this map. These are called category 1 basin in terms of oil and gas resources. They are discovered oil and gas found in these basins. We have added one more in this list, which is the Bengal basin, because recently we have discovered oil and gas in Bengal basin, which has started production also. So, right now we have 7 basins where we have oil and gas. Now, remember that 1.73 trillion reserves that I talked about in the previous slide. Out of that, India holds a very tiny part, about 4.7 billion barrels of reserves as of 2019. And 2 states within India holds majority portion of that. One is the state of Maharashtra. In the offshore part of Maharashtra, we have the biggest oil fields known as Mumbai High, and the other one is in the Assam-Arakan geological belt, which holds about 27% of Indian reserves. Interestingly, the first oil was discovered by the Britishers way back in 1866, and that was found in one of the fields called Digboy in Assam, which is still under production. What is India's production? India currently produces about 700,000 barrels of oil per day, which is only 13% of our domestic consumption. So, a large amount, almost 85% of the oil that we consume domestically is actually imported, and that is why we are not part of OPEC, because we are net importer rather than net exporter of oil and gas. Now, let us show you in bit detail the Indian oil and gas fields. Now, remember the definition of oil field and oil province that I talked about. The red dots in this map that you see are oil fields. Now, you can clearly see that there is certain places in India where there is a concentration of oil fields, that is, there are multiple oil fields located in a certain geographical portion of India. Those can be called the oil provinces. What are the major oil provinces? One is of course the Mumbai offshore. The major field there is the Mumbai High, which produces maximum amount of oil for India even today. The next oil province is the Gujarat, the Cambay basin. The major fields in that province are the Kalol field, the Ankleshwar field, and so on. The third oil province can be seen in the existing in the northeastern part of India, in the Assam-Arakan region, and many more fields like Digboy are there in that region. But interestingly, the biggest onshore field of India, which I told you in the previous slide, is Mangala, actually is located in the Rajasthan under the Thar deserts. This is one field where I have worked, and I have also worked in many of these fields in the Cambay region, and these are very prolific fields where we produce a lot of oil. The fields in Rajasthan at its peak produced about 25% of India's total oil production. Let us summarize what we learned so far. So, in this lecture we have learned about petroleum province, and we have talked about petroleum reserves. How do we define reserves? How in a standard way we define reserves so that we can compare between countries, between companies. We talked about the geographical distribution of hydrocarbon in the world as well as in India. We talked about the major fields in India and where they are located. Thank you.